Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Obama's second term. No sooner than the dust has settled over the election results that we found ourselves going into another sandstorm, which is the gridlock in the capital, Washington, D.C. And what we want to do in this program is to talk about what might be expected from a second term for Obama and where would the United States be heading in terms of domestic and foreign policy. With us, we have two professors from the University of Hawai'i, Mānoa. Professor Noel from Ethnic Studies, thank you for being with us. And Professor Jairus from Political Science, thank you for being with us. So what we want to first begin with is perhaps like your experience in terms of elections and so forth, you having been worked for Democratic candidates before. And so if you would give us that, and that might tell us something about your interests in terms of American politics and so forth, and what are your first impressions about the elections and maybe second term for Obama?
I've worked for various candidates over the years. I worked for Obama back in '08 in Ohio. I worked for John Kerry in Ohio as a sort of Hawaii person who went over there to work the streets and work the telephones at a basic level. And I've worked for candidates in Hawaii too, of course. One of the things that really struck me about this election was just watching TV election eve and watching the Republicans in Boston and the Democrats in Chicago. We were waiting for Romney, waiting for Obama. And the Chicago group looked like America in 2012. I mean, there were white people, there were Asians, there were blacks, there were Hispanics. I mean, it was an American gathering. And the Republican gathering was basically a group of people who sort of maybe looked like me a little bit, these older white men and women, who, and I think this really told the story. Yeah. And if we look at the election, it's the minorities and minority Americans that put Obama over. For 59% of the of white Americans voted for Romney. So this tells us that 70% of Latinos, 75% of Asians voted for Obama. This tells us that basically the Republicans are out of touch. I mean, the reality of what America is really out of touch with where we're going in this country.
Yeah, thanks. Jairus, how about your experiences and your interests in the American elections, American politics, beyond your being a professor of political science?
My first job in high school was actually moderating city council debates in Houston. I was immediately interested because I was a high school and college debater in politics. And so have a long tradition of volunteering for campaigns. And in 2008, I actually took a semester off graduate school and went to Florida to work as an organizer. So I was running the Orlando-Ocala strip, trying to get as many volunteers, knock on as many doors, convince people it was safe to go to the polls if they were African American in Central Florida, which was actually a real problem in 2008. There was a lot of intimidation. And so there's, I've had a long-standing interest, particularly in the Democratic Party. And in part, there was a level of, people jokingly called us hopium addicts, right? There was a period of withdrawal after 2008 where some of us had very high expectations for what Obama would be able to accomplish. And given my research and interest in the sort of changing technology of warfare, I think a lot of us hoped we weren't going to see the kind of continuation of Bush foreign policy, and instead saw in many ways a more innovative version of the same kind of war on terrorism and a kind of escalation in the war on drugs in Mexico and sort of the fighting with the cartels. And so it was interesting to watch how much that didn't become part of the election. And I mean, I think it was notable in all three debates, but certainly the last two, which were supposed to focus on foreign policy, there was no mention of climate change, and there was no mention of drone warfare. The closest we came to actual foreign politics was finger pointing over Libya. and what happened in Benghazi. So I think it was surprising to me and also, relieving that Obama was able to carry the kind of progressive vote that he was able to. I don't think a lot of people stayed home. I mean, we won't know, 100% what the turnout was.
Which was surprising, given the fact that so many people were disillusioned or disenchanted. People who had been fiery supporters of his back in 2008, they basically stayed with him. Youth, women, minorities, and they basically brought him home in this election.
I think there were a number of unforced errors by Romney that helped that more than anything. I mean, I think, if you look at the numbers just before Sarah Palin joined the McCain ticket, Obama's chances were good but not great, right? Palin really pushed over the edge. I think some of the Aiken comment about rape, a couple of issues that really outed Ryan as being this kind of more of an Ayn Rand follower than a follower of Jesus Christ. These sort of issues pushed that kind of progressive vote, I think, out. At the very least, to vote against Romney, if not to vote for Obama.
And the Democrats were very shrewd in basically framing the whole election around that. This is the critical election of the century so far, and we have two basically opposing ideologies here. Even if on some issues like foreign policy, they sounded very, very similar.
No, Daniel Dressner made this point, which is that this is the first time in an American election in which Democrats are actually polling better than Republicans on foreign policy, which I don't think is a real shift in public opinion. I think it's actually a real shift in the Democratic Party, which is to say mainline popular foreign policy in terms of sort of a balance between aggressive, violent policy and a relatively restricted involvement in things like development assistance and foreign aid, puts the Democrats squarely in an unfortunately large bipartisan middle. So I think it's
like passive-aggressive policy, U.S. policy in the area. Anyway, I interviewed Cynthia Franklin, professor from English at Mānoa, and we listened to what she had to say about the Romney-Obama situation and their positions, and then we can discuss more, because she touched on some of the things that we have just talked about.
It's not like I'm an Obama enthusiast by any means. I think he's done some really bad things in terms of foreign policy. I think his domestic policy has been in many ways incredibly disappointing, especially his backing of Wall Street. And yet, when faced by Romney, I do think there is a significant difference between the two of them. And I think Romney is pretty terrifying, actually. I think his willingness to sell out on any position, except for, I think, women's issues, where he is consistently, I don't think he flip-flops around women's issues, actually. I think he's pretty horrible in a consistent way. The fact that he is a candidate who has been unwilling to state he believes in equal pay for equal work, when he's willing to say all kinds of stuff that he then just converts, to me is an indicator of a person that I don't want in the White House. His positions on choice or abortion are completely scary to me, and the fact that he seems to have no qualms about bringing his religious convictions into the White House, also really, really bad. And that he's been pretty upfront about the fact that the Supreme Court appointments that he would have made as president would have been ideological. All of that together, for me, has meant there's a very significant difference between Obama and Romney.
Yeah, so some of the stuff we were talking about, she touched upon, but any more thoughts about what Cynthia has said?
Well, she's absolutely right. He's been a chameleon. I mean, he's changed his positions, but how could he not? Given the fact that to get the nomination, he has to appeal to a Republican base, which is highly conservative, and basically would prefer to support someone like Paul Ryan. So, in a sense, Romney was victimized by the fact that he's probably a Republican moderate, whatever that means, who basically has to appeal to a right-wing audience and then shift over suddenly during the general to his moderate position, in which he probably prefers, you know, and that's the irony of this election, one of the ironies.
Yeah.
I think this is also the tale of the sort of Tea Party courting coming back to haunt the Republicans, which is that you can put together a lot of House and maybe even a Senate race or two around issues that range from building a wall around the border, going back to the gold standard, an aggressive foreign policy, a retraction of foreign policy, right? All of these serious contradictions that you see across the kind of new Republican divides. Putting that together into a presidential platform, I think, is nearly impossible, right? So, you know, is Romney a great leader? No, but flip-flopping was a weird inevitability, I think, of the current composition of the Republican Party. They haven't figured out how they're going to, you know, sort of square the circle.
But Bush managed to do that, though, and get elected twice at a certain level. The traditional conservatives and also the moneyed elites on Wall Street and other places who support the Republicans. So why has it become harder to carry that act out?
I think that the Tea Party conservatives are a slightly different element, right? So if you look at someone like Rand Paul is not either the kind of Wall Street conservative, nor is he even the traditional, you know, evangelical conservative that we would think about from sort of the Pat Robertson line finding its way, Ralph Reed style, into the GOP. It's a bizarre combination of authoritarianism and libertarianism, right? It's about, you know, cracking down on racial minorities and racial profiling and building up the security state, and at the same time gutting the regulatory state, building a fortress around the country, right? All of these things that they're not an intellectually coherent position. And so I think Romney had a harder job than Bush did.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like what you said in the beginning, that you look at the Chicago campaign, you know, the meeting, and you see like a cross-section of America there, whereas in Boston it wasn't. It was like mostly white and so on. So that speaks to, you know, why the Republicans have a problem. Okay, but if that's the case, how come did the Republicans get 58.4 million of the popular vote versus Obama 61.6 something million of the popular vote?
I think that partly speaks to the failures of the Obama administration, especially in terms of job creation or raising the standard of living of millions of people. We have 44 million people still in poverty, 19 million in extreme poverty. You know, we can sort of go on with this. Unemployment remains staggeringly high in many places. So for many people, at least on the economic level, Obama has been discredited. There's also the racial factor. Obama will both gain votes. You know, 93% of black voters voted for Obama. Will lose votes among many whites on the basis of his color. You know, when I was in Ohio, I talked to some white voters basically who told me point blank they would not vote for a black candidate. So I mean, I think there's a number of, but one has to also look at the fact there's been some major failures of policy. Obama's rhetoric has always been outstanding, but the policy hasn't really matched the rhetoric, unfortunately.
Yeah, any more on that, Jairus?
Yeah, just that in some ways, you know, he was a victim of setting expectations way too high. You know, I think, you know, I was disillusioned in some ways, but I was also not surprised in a lot of others. You know, we forget that one of the reasons Bush could get so much done in 8 years is because he had a flagrant disregard for the law, right? I don't know that I would want Obama to be attaching riders to everything that he could, executive signing statements that were remaking policy in his own image, invoking executive privilege at every opportunity. And so I think we wanted too much on the left, right? We wanted our own imperial president. And I don't think that's something that Obama wants to be. And so I think that combined with, I think that Obama was a little naive going into the first administration. I think he really believed in this idea of building a new middle. And the Republicans were not there to do it. So I think it's hard to swallow that amongst the electorate.
And probably he might still try it this second term around.
Let's hope not
you
for
know.
long.
Yeah, and there may be like structural reasons in terms of capitalist globalization and the role of U.S. in this capitalism, and that you cannot do it otherwise just like Clinton was trying to do a different kind of coalition too, from the usual U.S. Style politics and coalitions for governing and leading the country.
I thought Cynthia was a bit too negative about, talking about. I mean, there are positive achievements. Certainly, the health care law, what they call Obamacare, is, it's not what we wanted. It still leaves big pharma and big insurance and big hospitals, in a major control of the American health system. But certainly it brings 19, 20 million people who had no coverage. It gives them coverage, and it probably lowers costs ultimately. I mean, the system is still dysfunctional, but it's more functional than it was, and that's an achievement.
Yeah, that's true, and I don't think she would disagree with you, but she was disappointed because I talked with her at length. She's disappointed that he stopped like short of for all kinds of reasons. He cannot like buck the real health industrial complex, so to speak. So I want to go back to Cynthia's other segment, because she also talked in that about some of the things that we said there was a lack of discussion about, the ones you mentioned. So we'll do that and then we'll go from there.
There was no discussion of climate change, no discussion of the problems with drilling for oil. Romney was quite upfront about being in favor of the pipeline. That to him, there's no problem there. Obama doesn't say that. That's a difference that matters to me. So, I think that even though I find Obama really disappointing on these issues of immigration, of energy, of all kinds of rights, of how strict he's going to be with bankers and bailing out the banks, there's a difference to me, and that difference actually does matter.
Yeah, so a difference that matters for a change, So any more on that, Noel?
Obama's approach to foreign policy, which wasn't the Bush-Rumsfeld, attack and attack and attack and assert American supremacy around the globe. I mean, this is refreshing. I was very disturbed during the campaign to hear these sort of ad hominem attacks that Romney made on the Chinese. This is a very delicate situation in the South China Sea. We have to end this sort of mutual military rat race, this mutual buildup, which really threatens Hawaii, of course, too. I mean, we're right in the middle of the ocean, and I thought it was really unconscionable for Romney to use this as a sort of presidential rhetoric.
Some people mentioned that he was saying this for like popular consumption, because he actually has investments in China. And then he said, well, I don't know about them, maybe like...
It's a blind trust.
But the Chinese are listening. The Chinese are listening to this, and basically they, I mean, China needs to be our partner, our economic and political partner in a sense. We have differences in terms of the system. We may be very critical of the Chinese Communist Party and the way it operates and the repression of freedoms. But a partnership is critical in terms of the peace in the Pacific and the rest of the world. And,
and the other thing, I mean, he said some things about Putin too, Romney, like saying, I know how to deal with Putin, whatever. And then Putin basically like dismissed him, said like, go away or something like that. You know about that? Yeah. Could you say more about that?
Well, I think, there's a tendency in every election to go after the president for coddling tyrants, right? I mean, Clinton did it to the first Bush. He said, you're being too soft on China. He brought up Tibet. He brought up all these human rights issues. Clinton was as constructive with China as any president before or after him. And Bush tried to do the same thing to Gore, saying Gore was part of this Clinton coddling of China. And then Bush, the second, turned right back around and built a partnership. So I think there's an extraordinarily dangerous element of the Republican Party that requires an enemy. And they need it in every election. And China, Russia, and Iran became those three places where we were going to beat the drum as loud as possible in hopes of getting something back on foreign policy. And again, that's another thing I think we have to give due credit to Obama for. The momentum towards war in Iran is strong. He's run, and I think this is partly Hillary Clinton, but extraordinary interference diplomatically to slow Israel down. Various numbers of ways to try to slow Iran down, some of them questionable, but certainly managed to not give in, which would have been very easy, right? To bash Iran, bash China, and put himself in a position where the House Republicans would force him to be more aggressive.
Yeah, but then what would be the difference between him and the Republican, yeah?
Yeah.
At least in terms of the election, the race, yeah?
Although I think this is an election of the economy matters, right? It was the job stupid this time around.
Right.
And so I think there were a lot of opportunities like oil to try to outflank the Republicans. And there were noticeable times where Obama just refused to do it. He wasn't going to make that kind of concession.
But given what you're saying, it's very interesting because he gets elected, Obama gets elected with very, very high unemployment, with the economy still in the doldrums, some signs, some glimmers of economic recovery in a few places, but the housing starts are up and this sort of thing. But he gets elected despite this, despite the fact he's he's a black candidate, and which is still something that many white voters aren't comfortable with. So to me, the re-election it's a real story. I mean, it's really something that's in some ways it's very surprising. You'd expect, given if you see the data out there, you'd expect Romney to be walking into the White House in January.
I actually think the data question is interesting, though. Right? There's been this whole fight over Nate Silver. Is he the new prognosticator? And I thought Silver made a really great argument, which is that his math wasn't that sophisticated. The reality was there was never a point in which Romney had a real electoral chance. Right? If we look at the polls on a state-by-state and a county-by-county basis, and he called out the media. He was like, look, are you really saying that this is a coin flip, which is what the headlines were, or are you making it a coin flip so that we can have something to report? And I think it's true that it's surprising that Obama didn't face more opposition, but there were some real investments that made real dividends. I mean, bailing out the auto industry was something he did early on, and it paid off. I mean, I think Ohio and Michigan proves that kind of investment in American business made a real difference for him.
Yeah.
And
Risky investment, but it paid off. I mean,
extraordinarily risky
GM could have gone under,
Right.
and then it would have looked like a disaster.
Maybe. But I still think that people in Michigan would have respected him for it.
Yeah.
These are people who are the last bit of industrial labor in our country that could live good lives and work in factories. And that's something that's disappearing. And so even holding on to it, I think, gave him a little bit of credibility.
It's interesting. What we might do now is look at the map to see which candidate won what states. So that would give us an idea about what we're talking about in terms of who won what and why. In fact, a number of people who worked the numbers didn't see any chance for Romney. I mean, exactly what you're saying. But the map we will show now show which states went to which candidate. And then we have another map about the popular vote to give us a better idea where the Republicans won, basically in the counties, the big counties. But yeah, well, that's the map regarding the state winner who won that. So you see the kind of blue thing. That's basically Obama, and then the others were Romney's. So it gives you an idea who has more voters voting for him in which state.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's a coincidence, but the dark red are reversals. So that's Indiana, North Carolina,
That's
which
right.
is were the real sort of regressions for Obama.
And then Florida still is out, but we were talking under the air that most probably it will be Romney's. Yeah.
No, I think Obama's.
Obama's?
Yeah, I think Obama still has a narrow lead.
So in Florida. Oh, okay.
As long as there's no butterfly ballots, things will be fine.
Yeah. Okay.
It's within a very small margin. I mean, he has basically 1 percentage point.
Right. So the other one, the other map is about the popular vote, and we'll see how it maps out. in terms of the Republican versus the Democrats. Right there. Yeah, so it gives you an idea.
I mean, what this shows also, if I can
Yeah,
say this,
sure.
is that Obama's support came overwhelmingly from urban constituencies,
Right.
from the cities, metropolis, and rural states and rural areas basically supported Romney.
Romney,
So
yeah.
just in terms of the gender conflict, you know, the class, the age, we've also got, you know, we've also got a regional
a good
thing.
one,
It's
yeah.
very,
But most of the population is in the cities and the urban, suburban areas, and not so much in the other big counties, yeah. So this is another an interesting thing. One thing that you know, I was you know, we're like in 2012, right? And still people talking about white black, you know, in the United States. And one of the commentators said, well, what Romney needed to have is like at least 74% of the electorate to be white for him to win, you know. But now it is 72%, so he would have a problem. So to me, I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's depressing to think that people are thinking along these lines. But what does this tell us about the dynamics between race and class, for instance?
Well, I think it's a reality that in this country, class is still highly racialized, and so it's not altogether shocking, right? I think it also demonstrates. Well, I should say this. I think there's a difference between the kind of racism of accusing Obama of being, you know, really Kenyan, right? The kind of birther narrative, and a real sense amongst particularly rural white Americans that they've been left behind by the Democratic Party. You know, it's a great irony of American politics that the Republicans are the strong supporters of the welfare state known as ag subsidies, and the Democrats are the big opponents of such a thing. And so, you know, I remember one voter telling me in Florida that he wanted to vote for Obama. He was white and poor, but his concern was that there was a kind of racial solidarity. Not that Obama was a bad guy, but that if he himself were in office, he'd take care of his own first. And I think we have to disaggregate racism from still a kind of racial identification, right? A sense of linked fate, which Obama has made real strides, I think, in making inroads into. But it's a powerful feeling. It's got a long-standing tradition in institutionalized politics. So it's not the kind of thing we're going to overcome overnight. I mean, it's instead more impressive, right, that we nominated a guy whose father is from Kenya and who, you know, whose middle name is Hussein. Right? This happened fast.
and for millions of blacks, especially young blacks, and also Latinos, it basically signifies a sense of imagination for them, which they never would have had ordinarily. And this may be his greatest contribution ultimately, that basically he's fired the imagination of millions of Americans who never believed. I mean, when I was growing up, the idea that a black person could be president or none was absolutely unimaginable. And that's changed. He's changed that whole territory.
Yeah, it was a significant development in terms of American politics, to be sure. But we still have this racial politics that we all are aware of. I want to go to another segment from Cynthia Franklin's. And she talks about Obama, his temperament as a mediator, etc., something that we basically alluded to in the beginning. So we'll do that.
I think he believes in a lot of kind of neoliberal principles, number one. I don't think he's just conceding. I actually think he kind of believes in them. And then I also think that you know, I feel like every president has a certain kind of arrogance about them. And it strikes me that his particular arrogance is this idea that by being smart enough and being sensible enough, he can conciliate, he can make people see his way. And he obviously can't, you know, when it comes to the GOP. They want to take him down. And I feel like this kind of commitment to being reasonable and to crossing the aisle completely doesn't work. You know, what has that got him? It's got him these GOP people who say he won't cross the aisle over and over. I mean, it was just astonishing to hear Romney keep throwing that at Obama, and and even then he's just so disgusted by this, right, that he just kind of smirks and he's like, do I really have to deal with someone this stupid? So I think Obama's intelligence and his sense of superiority also takes the form of, well, if I just talk to these guys, they'll see this makes sense. No, they won't, and so I do think that the left does have a role to play in really putting huge amounts of pressure on him. I think in some ways he responds to that mediating role, and there wasn't enough coming at him from the left for him to be able to do. I think he is by temperament a mediator.
Yeah. So any.
I think that's a very good, very insightful. Cynthia's got a very insightful thing. I would tend to think that Obama's growing up here. Also, I mean, I'm thinking of him as this mixed race kid who's trying to negotiate, being local or at Punahou, or was very instrumental in terms of his need to, to mediate and to facilitate and to be a person who was very cautious in terms of how he approached people. So I think this is deeply embedded in his own personality of who he is. On the other hand, I was thinking the last statement she made is very good, because American society basically, and this has nothing to do with Obama, but basically is arrayed against any kind of transformative change politically. I mean, that's just not on the books. I mean, if you look at the power of corporate capital, the power of wealthy people here, the power of institutions controlled by elites, transformative change is very, very hard to do, and it takes a deep crisis like in 1933 to see something like that happen, with the Roosevelt and the New Deal. And so even if Obama was a transformative politician, which he's not, he would have found tremendous obstacles to doing that, tremendous pressure to do it. And I think what needs to be done, and this is what she's saying here, is that you need to have a large-scale mass movement which is involved both inside and outside politics to make any kind of real change at this point. And that needs to put unceasing pressure on Obama. One of the problems, I think, with Bill Clinton is that there was no real left, people coming from the left who were really pushing him to enact, new kinds of programs and to really look at the American political scene in a different way. And therefore, I think Clinton could have been a much more radical president than what he ultimately turned out to be, which is very moderate and very conciliatory. So I think people like us who feel that this country needs some transformative change need to be there, both in the streets, if it needs to be in the streets, but also in the political process to really be pushing and challenging and offering alternative programs to the ones that are.
Yeah, because my other question, like to you, Jairus, on that, where would the left come from? I mean, you mentioned at the end, but I mean more on that.
I think calling it the left at this point in time is dreamy in a way that I wish were true, but dreamier maybe than what we have.
That's true, I agree.
And so, it's not just about putting pressure on Obama, right? The healthcare debate, I think, is a great example of him wanting to take this mediation role that Cynthia was talking about, which I think is absolutely correct. Imagine if there had been a progressive caucus that had pushed a serious bill for a single-payer system, and then the Republicans, scream bloody murder, and Obama could have come in with the full healthcare package he had in mind as the splitting of the difference, right? That would have been a totally different kind of debate. Instead, Obama's relatively moderate healthcare reform had to be put forward as the left option, for which then he had to make a number of cuts to appease the right. And so I think it's about also putting real pressure on the Democratic Party, that they need to have an agenda that is to the left of Obama, so that he's not having to outflank himself. He actually can play a role to try to build something like a middle. I do think that in this sort of next off-season House election, there's going to be some Republicans who are concerned about whether or not counties that they have to draw from are just not going to vote for them. And so I think while this didn't work the last time around, and I don't want him to be overly idealistic and pragmatic about it, there's probably some poachable Republicans on some issues that he could push forward.
Yeah.
My question is why in January of 2009, when Obama had just won a resounding presidential victory, when the House and Senate were both Democratic when he had a huge upsurge of popular support in the streets, on the campuses, every place. At that point, he didn't mobilize his base for some sort of real change, and I think this tells us something about who he is and how he operates, because that would have been the absolute ideal time. I mean, Bush had been discredited, the economy was in shambles, the health system was obviously totally dysfunctional, unemployment was growing, there was popular anger against Wall Street for all the depredations the hedge fund capitalists and all the others had done. That would have been the ideal time. Yeah. I mean, so this represents a very different time. I mean, there's still possibilities there.
Sure, but this to me is also the failure of the Democratic Party, right? They didn't have a platform ready to go. I think they were in some ways as taken by surprise with Obama's victory as the rest of us were, which is to say there was not a coherent strategy by the Democratic Party that was going to lay out that agenda that he could lead on. And he was the new kid in town. I mean, I think we underestimate the degree to which he wasn't really quite ready for this job, right? This is not. We wanted a 2-term senator, right? Or maybe a 3-term senator who had that kind of experience.
This is good because, 2004, in his speech before the Democratic Convention, then 2008 already, like he was running and he won, So that's
too soon. Too soon. Maybe too soon.
So one wonders who was pushing him, even pushing him against whom? Against Clinton, I mean, that's another thing that might tell you something about the power play, behind the scenes and so forth, and elite politics, etc. That's not part of the everyday debate. But the other thing in terms of Obama, I was thinking, like some of the in the first term, he didn't go into to the base and mobilize it. Yeah. That's why, like a number of Democrats now in positions of quote unquote power, in terms of that kind of politics, Democratic Party politics, so saying like you most probably will see a different kind of Obama this time, who would go to the people and try to speak to the people and not only to the House and Senate, Well, I don't know if he has it in him to do so, but at least I think if he has a plan this time and he's the man with the plan, then that's the only way he could execute his plan. I mean, the way we were talking about it.
But I think Cynthia's onto something too, which is, Obama was a kind of Rorschach test for the left. We all saw exactly what we wanted to see in him. And the reality is, if you look at his record in Illinois, he was not a radical. Not only was he not a radical, he wasn't even that progressive of a Democrat. He was with the Republicans on bankruptcy reform. He was with the Republicans on credit and interest reform. I mean, he's not a revolutionary. No. And so I don't think we're likely to see grand vision from him. I think what we're likely to see is more consolidation of his priorities, better strategizing on how he's going to get it through, and knowing more about how the political process works. And so a kind of learning curve, more than we're likely to see the sort of Obama tear his shirt away and be the Superman for the left.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, but I'm saying like what some Democrats are saying. But no, I completely agree, and we cannot forget, for instance, that who is Obama? I mean, he's the leader of the free world or global capitalism, And so there is, even though he does not have a plan, and I agree with you in terms of how might I execute and arrive at the, those policies to arrive at the goals of global capitalism, which the U.S. would be dominating. He didn't have that kind of plan, but definitely there was clear goals for global capitalism and U.S. domination of that. Yeah, and I think that is the bottom line here. Yeah.
Even his speech, I mean, his acceptance speech, or the speech that he gave, I mean, it was full of these American mythologies, like every, we want a country in which every kid can, if he works hard, he can have a decent. That world is, you were saying this before. That world is gone, and I mean, without education, special skills, special training, you really don't have a chance in this economy. And then he was going back to this old conundrum. This is the greatest country in the world, and I'm thinking, okay, this is a great country, but it's also a country which has the 34th, in terms of child poverty, it's number 34 among developed nations. In terms of mathematical literacy, it's number 50. You know, you can go.
Education.
Yeah,
health,
I mean, in many ways, this
yeah.
is a startlingly dysfunctional country for all its wealth and power. So.
In that respect, though, I think we are likely to see more kinds of Keynesian smoothing the edges or the rough edges out of capitalism, which is to say, I think I would never expect a U.S. president in the current political climate that we have to do anything serious about the structure of the economy. But you know, even in the early part of his first term, he wanted labor representation at the table for CAFTA. You know, he wanted to sort of empower unions in particular ways. He's got a much more robust agenda for education and sort of paying for higher education. So it's again, I don't think we're going to see a radical change, but I do think that there is a real difference between the way that he would address that kind of structural inequity and the way that Romney would.
No, that's true. And it's interesting. I mean, some of the things that we mentioned, those like the electorate is, the women are 54%, constitute 54%. Men constitute 46%. That's an interesting thing. And then Romney gets 47% of the men's vote, and Obama gets 53% of the women's vote. So that's like a very interesting kind of thing. And in terms of the white votes, according to those stats that I heard, Obama gets 39% of the white votes, and Romney gets, I think, 74% or something like that. You know, so that's like a very interesting thing. Not 74%, but maybe like 58%. Yeah. So that's interesting.
One of the disturbing aspects of the post-election news has been, you know, this riot at the University of Mississippi where they were burning, hundreds of white students were burning Obama's poster, and you get calls for secession coming from, you know, places in the Deep South and other things where there's a real, almost visceral hatred of Obama and everything he seems to stand for, especially perhaps now after he's come out in favor of same-sex marriage. I mean, you know, he's equated with the devil in some areas of the population. So, I mean, in a sense, what we're seeing is how deep the sort of animosity and the feeling of estrangement from basic democratic values are. You know, and that's a little bit disturbing.
Yeah, because this speaks to like the question of creeping fascism. I mean, in terms of a mass base for fascism. I mean, that would take advantage of all these kind of divisions in American society, which is black, white, Christian, non-Christian, and gay and straight, and all that kind of stuff. That is, you know, would create a social base for fascism. That in the dynamics or the developments for the merging of the state and the corporation in ways that haven't been even when Eisenhower talked about the industrial military complex, that would create a big problem, and it moves us towards fascism. And in fact, I would argue that we are already moving in a big way towards fascism, given like, you know, all these national security laws and so forth, from Homeland Security and all that, So
I would not characterize it as creeping fascism as much as consolidating fascism, which is to say, I don't think it's spreading as much as it's consolidating and intensifying.
Okay, I agree with you.
And I think that's actually something you see on the demographic map, right? So if you were to overlay that demographic map with something like the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map, what you would see is an increasing intensification of the KKK and other hate groups in those areas.
No, I agree.
And I think it's important to take the Republican Party to task for that. To be perfectly honest, they have had a kind of wink-wink, nudge-nudge arrangement with hate groups, right? So, you know, there are people screaming things at McCain rallies in 2008, which the Republican Party is not coming out against. We have Ron Paul accepting money from a Grand Dragon of the KKK and not giving the money back. And I think what tips that from being a kind of extreme populism, right, that a political party normally will sort of go after, is the degree to which the Republican Party now seems to understand as part of their election campaign the changing of the rules of elections.
Yeah.
Right. So the number of places that they're trying to redistrict, the number of places they're trying to change the ways in which you enroll to register to vote in the first place. I think that becomes really dangerous. You can get a kind of resonance between that kind of popular fascism and institutional fascism when a political party says it's not about democratic values anymore. It's not about winning elections. It's about rigging elections.
Yeah, I would. I just want to make clear one thing. I agree with you in terms of the consolidation, but I would also want to distinguish between the mass base for fascism that might be consolidated and the movement in terms of more consolidation, if you will, between the corporations and the states through all kinds of measures, privatization, other things, or the corporations themselves writing the laws more in ways that they haven't been writing them before, because lobbyists do write the bills, etc. by and large. But the fact of the matter, we're talking about a real marriage between state and corporations that we haven't seen before. So I would distinguish between those two motions, which are coming together as well, because one would depend upon the other, or in fact the corporation-state merger would depend on a mass base that they would employ for their own requirements and needs. This reminds me, in terms of National Socialism, how in the first place, like Hitler, depended upon a lot of these like gangs and this and that. And then once he consolidated, he wanted to be like more respectable. He wiped out a lot of those gangs and brought up the real fascists, And so that is, I think, an interesting thing to keep in mind when we're talking about this, yeah.
So we're talking about living in dangerous times.
Absolutely, yeah. The other thing I want us to start talking about, although we have touched on it in different ways, is the elections, and the result in the second Obama term in the context of global capitalism and international relations, etc., since we talked about China and Russia and so forth. How would you see a second term in terms of those kinds of things, like foreign policy, the dynamic between Russia, China, say on one hand, and maybe the BRICS countries, and the U.S. and its European allies, Western European mostly?
Well, I think it's telling that Obama made Petraeus the director of the CIA. To choose a military leader to head your intelligence agency says something about the way that you're going to approach international crises. And I think in particular, right, Petraeus made his bones trying to implement a new kind of warfare, which I think should probably best be compared to the way that people tried to characterize development in the 80s and 90s, which is to say, if we had to fight against sustainable development as if it were an alternative to development, I think now we have to fight against sustainable warfare. Part of that is drones programs. Part of that is relying more on special forces. The buzzword in the DoD now is about reducing the footprint of war, borrowing from the climate footprint from the ecological left. And so I don't think we're likely to see goals change much at all. I do think we're likely to see tactics change in such a way that the political profile of violence is much, much lower, much more difficult to identify, and therefore I think much more dangerous democratically.
Absolutely, and more people will be dying, out there, in the Middle East and other places. Africa and stuff like that.
It's questionable for me. I really dislike Bill Clinton. The thing that I think we often forget is Bill Clinton's sanctions policy on Iraq killed more Iraqis than both the Bush invasions. So there are a lot of ways to reinvent U.S. empire from the moderate democratic side, and I don't think the drone program is the sanctions program. But what I think makes it as dangerous is that it's not likely to ever reach the kind of critical juncture, and so it may kill people more slowly, but it will do it continuously in a way that I think is extraordinarily dangerous.
Yeah.
And this is an empire which doesn't have the substance or the resources to maintain itself as a policeman of the world anymore. So, I mean, this is a profound contradiction. I mean, maybe the drones are all about an empire on the cheap rather than occupying armies. So, you know, here we're running trillion-dollar budgets, trillion-dollar budget deficits every year. You know, we basically are fighting wars. We're using borrowed money from the Chinese and Germans and other people. I mean, this is unsustainable.
No, yeah.
$650 billion a year military budget is unsustainable. I mean, it's contributing to the crashing of the economy also. So, I mean, the empire itself is pushing the U.S. toward ruin at some level.
That's true. And one thing is we have like $16 trillion in public debt. You know, that's huge. I mean, how can you sustain something like this? And they're already talking about a fiscal cliff and all this stuff. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if you're talking about like smart power or some kind of other power beyond the question of like 350,000 troops going there, if you look at the sanctions, the drones, the special ops, CIA and all kinds of stuff, proxies, you know, give them the guns and they'll kill each other, you know, just like what's happening in Syria, for instance, and Iraq now too. Sure. Yeah, so all of that would be a different strategy, in fact, for military strategy for effecting strategic goals for the U.S. empire. Now, the contradiction is that the one you were talking about, how can we do that given the $16 trillion and all these kinds of deficits that we have been accumulating? And then gridlock in Washington, D.C., because the Republicans and the Democrats, both like parties of capitalist corporations, etc., and yet they have different ways of how to get there. You know, like for instance, Romney criticizing Obama for like trying to cut the military budget, even though like a lot of the generals don't want the military budget to be that high because they have this other kind of strategy, you know, the one you're talking about, reducing the footprint, drones and all that kind of stuff, sanctions and all that. So I think because of all of this, the U.S. empire is not a sustainable project. Yeah, but that makes it even worse in terms of, well, that's the only way I have to go, so I'm going to kill as many people, etc., just to try and maintain, if not like domination, but first among equals in a revamped international order, if that is possible. So, I mean, I don't know what your comments.
It's going to spill over into the domestic scene.
Absolutely.
In terms of violence, and as the empire begins to crumble and you know.
We can see this happening right now in terms of the division. I mean, the country is divided, and people talk about like David Gergen talks about like Obama doesn't have a mandate because, you know, 59 million or 58 million versus 61 million, you know, popular votes.
I have a slightly different take on it in that I'm less concerned about the Samson situation where we pull the empire down on our heads and more that we figure out how to sustain it. You know, I don't think it's I don't think the word is in yet on whether or not we can actually create this kind of lighter, tighter, more effective military. I mean, my concern is we will be able to do it and that it will kind of forestall the kinds of financial limits that we've really been facing. I mean, the reality is, I don't think Obama would have had a shot in 2008 if the Iraq War hadn't been going so badly, if the cost hadn't been so high. I mean, I'm more terrified of figuring out how to run empire efficiently than I am about it sort of collapsing in on itself.
Right,
You know, I mean, Mexico for me is this sort of perfect example of this, right? We have a country who, in a large part because of our gun sales, our drug consumption, that is as dangerous as Iraq was, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, and we're fighting a war there.
Except it's on our borders.
Yeah, it's directly on our
borders.
You know, right. And that's where I start to get really concerned about something like fascism. Right. It just takes a little bit of spillover from the conflict in Mexico, and suddenly you have the kind of nationalist rhetoric of shutting down the border, cracking down against people who don't look like the sort of normative white image of the American.
No,
if there's an influx of Mexican refugees, which there could be if the system turns totally dysfunctional, you're going to see, you know, the border will become absolutely militarized, and there'll be, you know, armies of people fighting each other. It'll be a civil war almost on the border.
And the Mexicans are well armed, and you know, they could bring the arms there that they got from the U.S. in the first place, you know, or most of it, yeah. But no, it's not a matter of like, you know, Samson and Delilah, so to speak, but it's a question, what other route do they have? They don't have except that, so they're gonna pursue it to try and save the empire. But then there are other forces in the world that are moving up, well, China, Russia, you know, and then Brazil and the rest of them. So that these guys are not gonna like say, okay, U.S., since you have the greatest military in the world and all the drones that, you know, whatever, that you cannot do it. So it becomes a more dangerous space. I mean, literally, I mean, the whole thing.
And again, on both sides.
Yeah.
I don't think that the prospect of China colonizing Africa, which is really what's going on right now, is a happy prospect for Africa.
Not at all, yeah, because it's a capitalist country, and they want to, you know, exploit the resources and the population and sell their ware and make profits. I mean, you know, yeah.
But it's a very different kind of primitive accumulation. China has down nearly to a science how one creates a particular kind of joint venture where most of the military violence gets done by the state. I mean, they've, I hate to say it, but the real deficit to our strategic partnership is they've learned well from us. And I hate to see what happens when a kind of race for energy resources pushes that to a fever pitch.
In fact, already there have been like contentions on that, like Libya, for instance. Russia and China lost Libya. Sudan, Russia and China lost Sudan. So it's a kind of competition among capitalists, all of them.
Well, the Spratly Islands, again, I think is an excellent example.
Very dangerous.
And one that we thought we had fixed. I mean, I think the Spratly Islands is the example where a lot of what we'd hoped for Obama didn't happen internationally, which is, you know, Bush basically gutted the international system. He undermined the United Nations, right? We haven't seen Obama take the kind of initiative to rebuild international organizations so that something like joint development could really work in the Spratly Islands. I don't know. There's a lot of diplomatic work to be done.
Yeah. And then the other thing, I mean, well, the last things they did, say in Libya, for instance, Libya is a basket case now, and it is threatening its neighbors, threatening Egypt, etc. Egypt itself is like boiling, and there are still like huge demonstrations and so forth against the Muslim Brothers, etc., which in fact the Americans are trying to play footsies with the Muslim Brothers, you know, right there. Syria is another situation. If Syria spills over, and it has already spilled over in terms of armed conflict to Turkey, a little bit, and to Lebanon, you know, Lebanon in the north. And the Jordanians are afraid for themselves. I mean, the King Abdullah II is afraid for his throne. The U.S. would sell him down the tubes in a second, you know, in a heartbeat. So all these things are very important to take a look at and see how a second Obama term would play on the international scene. And again, as you said, will spill over to the domestic scene, especially if, since we have Canada and then Mexico, mostly Mexico, on our borders.
Everything's connected. There are no, you can't compartmentalize anymore.
That's right.
Things are going to spill over.
Right. Okay, we thank you very much for coming. We're flat out of time, and thanks for our viewers, and see you in December. Aloha.